Hello, my name is Isaiah Rana, and today we'll be talking about countering the Belt and Road Initiative in the Indo-Pacific with development aid. So, before I get into the matter, I want to provide a brief overview on the Belt and Road Initiative. It began as the premier foreign policy tool of Beijing and was announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013. And it exists primarily as a widespread multi-regional infrastructure platform. Now, as you can see with the diagram shown here, it consists of an overland trade belt stretching from eastern China through Central Asia, through the Middle East, all the way to Eastern and Western Europe. And that is paired with a sea road of ports, obviously, again, from Eastern China down through South and Southeast Asia into the Middle East again, and then connecting through Africa up into the Mediterranean. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative has a twofold aim. It aims for an infrastructure and economic development platform for the global South, and it also aims to interconnect the Chinese economy with that of the globe. The ultimate goal of the Belt and Road Initiative really is to realign China at the center of a massive global trade and development network, wherein China is the key geopolitical player. Now, there is a certain necessity of countering China's influence via development aid. As we all know, great power competition is very much alive and well within the global arena. To paraphrase former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in his statement in the Biden administration's 2023 national security strategy, China is the only nation with the desire to realign the international order and the diplomatic, technological, military, and economic means to do so. Now, this was very much a fact in reality back in 2023 and has only grown more pertinent in 2025. And with the transition into the Trump administration, things have only become more interesting in this regard. Now, the Trump administration's rather inconsistent, widespread tariff policies have placed the United States in a very precarious position. The US has begun alienating key strategic allies, especially in Europe and also in North America, wherein our historical trade partners have been put on the out and out as the US pursues a position of autarky and really trying to be an economic island within the international community. This has also hurt developing nations, with export reliant economies being left vulnerable by the heavy tariffs that the US has placed on them. And so ultimately, China, in response to this shift in US trade policy, has further ingrained its stance as being willing and able as an economic partner for these not just Western and first world nations and middle powers, but especially for developing countries of the global South. So, in a scenario where the US is on the outside looking in economically, defense partnerships alone will not be enough to curb Chinese foreign policy. Now, let's give, for instance, a situation wherein China does finally decide to take militaristic action against Taiwan. In the lead up to this, the US will not have the soft power and specifically economic cachet to halt China in its tracks via regional and global influences from other states and other allies, and will be forced to rely on primarily defense partnerships such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, though, while very effective for the means of countering China from a naval and military standpoint, will not prevent us from reaching that point in the international community of potential hot interactions between China and the US on a military standpoint. Now, here is a strategy for countering China. Going for the Indo-Pacific, I believe that development aid can act as a bridge between the United States and alienated partner states. And I don't only mean that in the sense of states that the US has alienated via its recent trade policy revisions, but also those that had been really siphoned into China's sphere of influence via the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this can be achieved by taking the fight to China in their own backyard, aka the Indo-Pacific. It's really a matter of understanding the implications of soft power influences in a multipolar world. Rather than trying to fight China head to head or in much larger geopolitical bodies such as the United Nations, the US should look to engage with China on a regional basis And what better way to entice the states of those regions into one's own sphere of influence than to greet them with development aid? I believe two prime targets in the region for countering China's aim for, regional influence and broader global economic influence are India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, commonly known as ASEAN. And really, we want to approach these two bodies, this state and this bloc, as on a bilateral and multilateral basis. Obviously, bilateral being referred to in case of India, and multilateral in the case of ASEAN. Now, let's get into India. So, what is India's place in the global community? India really occupies a very unique space in the global community historically. They were long the face of the non-aligned movement, wherein they did not allow themselves to be tied to the sphere of influence of the, democratic liberal order of the West, or as heavily tied into the Second World and the Soviet sphere of influence. There's very much a growing power in the geopolitical sphere, wherein India has stepped up and even filled the gaps of aid that the US has left with natural disaster relief more recently in 2025. And then in the context of international affairs, India really exists as an island amongst its peers and geographic neighbors. So the question becomes, with a state that is very much inwardly focused, India first, and India foreign policy and domestic policy first, how is one going to crack the shell of the Indian subcontinent? Well, I believe we can do this by going after target sectors for development aid. A successful aid partnership with India can start by partnering with New Delhi on their own economic objectives. So rather coming at an aid strategy for India on the basis of just mutual aid and mutual development aid, there needs to be a specific ideology here wherein we see New Delhi's priorities in a development light and say, okay, we're going to meet you there and be your go-to partner to get India to that place. Now, agricultural development. It is the key platform for India in 2025 for the state's development. And this can be done from an aid perspective by partnering with India on agricultural technology developments, as well as providing them with market access for their agricultural goods and services to the broader globe. Manufacturing development is also an important position to take up, really positioning India as a Chinese alternative. With the decoupling from China that's occurred since COVID, it is really imperative to view India as a potential middle power that can be elevated to the same manufacturing place that China once held. And then also defense development, really fostering a coordinated self-sufficiency for India in that regard. In the same way that the US has Poland as a key defense partner in Europe and really a hedge against Russia in the region, India can very much be treated as the same way against China. And rather than just focusing on defense trade deals, there really should be a focus on providing aid for cybersecurity suites, defense manufacturing, and things of that nature to really help India become self-sufficient from a defensive perspective. Now, the most important aspect of really factoring India in on a bilateral aid perspective is pursuing the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Now, this is a formal alternative to the development networks fostered by the Belt and Road Initiative that will ingrain India in new formal trade relationships. It's really a pragmatic approach by a limited scope. And what I mean by that is, rather than, as we see with the Belt and Road Initiative, where it is expansive throughout the whole of Africa, through Europe, targeted spots in Europe, through the Middle East, through South and Southern Asia, and even in South America, this is a very core-focused group of states where it is India, specific Middle East states, and Europe. And really, this is also very helpful for the US because it helps prioritize World Bank funding toward regional infrastructure in these states. And it helps really promote India as, giving them access to not just these markets, but helping elevate India into becoming a multi-regional economic influencer to where they have say on a really global stage on economic direction and economic policy at a multilateral level. Now, let's switch to the multilateral perspective, speaking of multilateralism, and look at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and really, as it is, the future of the Indo-Pacific. So, what is this bloc? Well, ASEAN is a regional bloc of Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Founded in 1967 upon the principles of uplifting the region in line with the United Nations Charter. And really, this has continued this whole idea of mutual development, mutual uplifting, and mutual economic access has been core to ASEAN's ideology, where you see ASEAN operate as not just an economic trade platform for these states in Southeast Asia, but also as a shared security platform as well. And really, this has continued into the modern era with a major focus on encouraging ASEAN-centric progress in the Indo-Pacific. And what that means really is kind of similar in the same way that India is its own island in the international community. It's kind of that same ethos of India first, and now this is ASEAN first, where outside nations that want to deal with ASEAN as a bloc have to look to ASEAN-centric trade policies that will favor its membership and member states over really any other geopolitical aims that outside states wishing to deal with them may have. So let's take a look at ASEAN and the Belt and Road Initiative. With such a large membership base, the relationship between the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the Belt and Road Initiative varies greatly on a state-to-state basis. We see state groupings and pairs such as Vietnam and the Philippines, who have historically had contentions and rivalries with China that are very much continuing to the modern day, that are very slow to adopt the utilization of Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects, though I might add, they still have adopted them. And that is contrasted with the likes of Cambodia and Thailand, which have very much keyed in on utilizing Belt and Road Initiative aid via foreign direct investment from China itself, via development banks and things of that nature, and really focusing on things such as sustainable energy development and key transportation infrastructure developments as well as resource extraction development in that regard. And the Belt and Road Initiative projects have largely targeted those aforementioned sectors such as resource extraction, infrastructure, natural resources, but also has a key focus on things such as green technology and financial technical systems and financial technical services as well. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations as an organization is very much welcome to Belt and Road Initiative projects. And with a centralized focus on its core values and priorities, it's clear that they are a considerable, if not the most considered partner for the Belt and Road Initiative. Clearly being right in China's backyard, they make the most sense for expanding, economic soft power influence. But outside of that, more, from a trade perspective, really fleshing out that infrastructure and from a trade for trade routes and things of that nature has been a high priority of Beijing in utilizing the region for that going forward. So how do we go about courting ASEAN away from the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, in my mind, this should be done via multilateral cooperation opportunities. Targeting development efforts at ASEAN as a bloc rather than individual states is ultimately what Washington should key in on. Common value alignment where is a bonus here, because rather than having to worry about the different geopolitical statuses of the individual member states, the U.S. can approach ASEAN as a group and, by providing favorable trade deals to the bloc as a whole, and from a development perspective, allowing them to get their goods to different markets and things of that nature. It really helps the U.S. align with the values of the bloc and not get caught in the weeds of dealing with individual states. And really, there's a greater ease of coordination there, as I said, to where you're, not wasting time having to, how should I put this? Uh, get into these sometimes fragile systems domestically with Southeast Asian nations. And you really get a much more succinct and much more focused economic and development policy by dealing with the bloc as a whole. And then you look at organized opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative. If the bloc operates on the whole, and this is within the global community, looking at bodies such as the United Nations, if you see this bloc move as a whole toward U.S. influence, it'll be much easier for them to provide global opposition to, belligerent moves such as we've seen with Russia and Ukraine. If China was to imitate that with Taiwan, it'd be much easier to curb that from a soft power perspective if the bloc was to move as one into U.S. influence and U.S. sphere of influence, aid-wise and economically. And to do this, we have a couple of options here, such as utilizing the Blue Dot Network, which is a private sector global conglomeration of development aid banks and corporations from around the globe, whether that be in the Indo-Pacific or beyond. And then, connecting those with the states of the region via the Blue Dot Network would be a very crucial way of, eliminating, just foreign direct investment as a sole perspective for development aid, and really providing targeted development aid to specific sectors that foreign investment banks and foreign corporations may specialize in. And then also creating an organizational collaboration between ASEAN and the quadrilateral security dialogue, which of course includes the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. By doing so, the U.S. can act as the key collaborator and key coordinator between these groupings of nations, allowing for not just security collaboration, but also for economic, intertwinement between the states of the Pacific and the states of Southeast Asia. So I think there's also a major focus here from our international affairs and leadership program standpoint of considerations for character-driven leadership and principles. If the U.S. were to take up this policy of, keying in on development aid, there needs to be a major focus on weighing the trade-offs of responsibility versus pragmatism. And what do I mean by that? Does the U.S. have a responsibility to support the development of nations in the global South and middle powers such as India? Or should it focus again on autarky and individual gain for domestic foreign policy? And this really comes down to a matter of constructivism versus realism. Should the U.S. focus on global good and global development on the whole for the international community, or should it be really inwardly focused on kind of a realpolitik approach to geopolitics, and understanding whether values are more important than geopolitical gains is really something the U.S. is going to have to bargain with. And I think, for my own personal approach on this matter, a quote from famous U.S. diplomat and UN official Ralph Bunche, it really says it all to me in this regard, and that is, true power is not found in the control of others, but in the ability to empower others. And clearly, I favor the constructivist take a bit more in that end, in fostering global development on the whole. And I think that certainly needs to be considered when approaching a platform of development aid. So in conclusion, the Belt and Road Initiative is a significant threat to U.S. influence, globally, as Washington really withdraws from international affairs. Outside of defense strategies, equivalent development aid is truly a viable counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, as it focuses in on soft power on a regional level, taking the fight to China in the Indo-Pacific via bilateral strategies with India, and via multilateral strategies with the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, are approaches that are very amicable for the states involved, and are very achievable with the foreign policy tools that Washington has at its disposal. And it's really imperative that the US understands what its values and ethical alignments are going into this. Again, realpolitik versus a constructivist focused on rising tides raise all ships in the global community with development. And it's really upon Washington to take those steps to understand which it values more. And ultimately, I believe that if Washington was to invest in a development aid agenda, a very wide sweeping development aid agenda in these bilateral and multilateral strategies, we would see some, strong curbs to the amount of influence that Belt and Road Initiative has on the regional Indo-Pacific level, and most certainly abroad in neighboring regions and globally as well. Thank you.